Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction and for having me on this occasion. It's a great opportunity to present some of my thoughts on the topic. So you see my title here. So I will address issues of change, that I think are at the heart of this challenge to discuss disaster and conflict. I come from Sweden and work at Linnaeus University in the southeast of Sweden. And as you've just heard, I represent a UNESCO chair, and it's the UNESCO chair on heritage futures. But I have to be clear that I do not represent UNESCO here. So whatever I say is the view of my own view and not anybody else's. A brief comment on what heritage futures means. This is a term that is not yet in common use. I fear. We define it like this. It's about the roles of heritage in managing the relations between present and future societies. So it's not about predicting anything for the future, and it's not about conservation for as long as possible. It's about relations. So the topic that we are addressing here today, related to post-disaster and post-conflict issues, is very much a topic of heritage futures because it addresses how we want to move forward and which role heritage is playing in that sort of development. And that's why I'm very pleased to be able to speak here. Now, the context in which we are meeting here today is the International Day of Monuments and Sites for this year. And that is addressing the topic of disasters and conflicts, as I said, through the lens of the 1964 Venice Charter. And of course, this year we're celebrating 60 years of the Venice Charter, and that makes it particularly relevant, I think, to also return during my presentation and at the end to the implications my thoughts have for the Venice Charter. Now, my point is that the topic we're addressing raises some questions about preparedness, resilience, and recovery in the context of the ICOMOS doctrine on conservation and restoration, which is represented quite strongly by the Venice Charter I just referred to. Now, what are the questions that I think we need to address in this context? And I want to present two questions here. Now, the first one is that we need to ask preparedness, resilience, and recovery of what? And I believe that, and I'm not alone in this, that we really need to take a people-centered perspective here. So that means that we're talking about the preparedness, resilience, and recovery of people and society, not of monuments. And I believe that that is something that the Venice Charter doesn't recognize strongly enough. It focuses exclusively on sites and monuments. And I think that is a problem. And the reason why I think this issue of disaster and conflict is particularly relevant or particularly relating to people issues is, of course, that disasters are always people-made. A catastrophe, a natural catastrophe, is not a disaster unless people are badly prepared and not resilient enough. So the disaster aspect only arises in relation to people. An earthquake as such is not a disaster. And of course, conflicts even more so. They are caused by people. They happen between people. So they're always about people. And that's why I believe we need to put people first and address the preparedness, resilience, and recovery of people and their communities and societies. So this is the first question, I believe, which we need to ask and answer. I've given you my answer. Now, related to that, there's a second question. The second question then follows on from this and asks, how can people's preparedness, resilience, and ability for recovery be enhanced? Now, that's the important question in this context. What can we do through heritage in order to enhance people's conditions to deal with issues in the context of disaster and conflict? And here I have two answers that lead us away from dominant doctrine, but I think that I want to put to you here today and discuss with you and also give some examples of what I mean by that, because I believe these are strategies that would really help us to enhance preparedness, resilience, and the ability for recovery. Now, the first issue that I think it would help to decouple sites and monuments from identity. This is a connection that has been dominating the national heritage context around the world for the past 200 years or so. That sites and monuments were very closely connected to often national identities. And I think that's not always helpful, because it means that in a disaster, when sites and monuments are affected, at the same time also collective identities are affected. And that makes it harder, not easier, to deal with these challenges. So that's the first point. And the second point that I also believe is that we need to get better at embracing timely change, renewal, and regeneration, because that's really something that all heritage over time has always been about. All heritage is a story about change and to some extent renewal and regeneration. And by foregrounding that, I think we could also improve our preparedness, resilience, and ability for recovery in the context of disaster and conflict. Now, if these are valuable questions and interesting answers, then let's have a quick look at what the Venice Charter actually says on these issues. And here's just a short quote from the preamble, which sort of sets the tone of the whole charter. These are famous sentences, so you'll recognize them. It starts by saying that imbued with a message from the past, historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as living witnesses of their age-old tradition. The common responsibility to safeguard them for future generations is recognized. It is our duty to hand them on in the full witness of their authenticity. Now, as you see here, this is pretty much the opposite of what I've just presented. So the first part, where there's a reference to the sites and monuments as living witnesses of people's age-old traditions, this is really very much about identity, and it is really very much about how heritage is looking backwards to origins of a particular community. And the second point is very much not about change and regeneration, but it emphasizes the need to safeguard and hand on sites and monuments in the full witness of their authenticity. So that means as little affected as possible by later developments. And of course, then the charter goes on to specify what that means specifically. We don't need to get into that, but this is very much the spirit. So what I want to present from the perspective of Heritage Futures is an alternative to that thinking. And I believe in taking this seriously, we would be able to make progress on the issues that are at stake here in this meeting today. It would improve the preconditions for sustainability and advance issues like resilience. Now, I want to present two thoughts on that, two alternatives of thinking. The first one, I believe that we could benefit from understanding people, or from defining people, that is, from identifying people, not by looking backwards, but by looking at what goes on today. So by what people do and what they actually contribute to society. That should be what defines who we are as people and who we are together in a society. So it should be about what we do and contribute to society, not by who our ancestors were and what they left behind. And if that is so, what we're doing today and what we're contributing, this is very much about intangible issues. It's not necessarily about monuments. So, and I think that reflects the increasing significance of intangible heritage in the world. More and more people and their politicians and leaders realize that intangible issues are central for people's identities and for the relations between people in society. And I think rightly so. And the reason is that it allows us to to look at what goes on today, to collaborate with other people, to learn from each other, and then to look forward with the skills and traditions that we practice today. So that's the first thing. I think it's good to define identity by looking around us and by being able to contribute today to particular processes in society. And then there's a second aspect, a second alternative way of thinking through this. And that is that I believe, like trees and other life forms, monuments and sites are processes in landscapes that are realizing a potential for growth. They're not manifestations of distinctive acts of creation and living witnesses of the past, as the Venice Charter has it. So that means that I believe that monuments and sites, if you look at them, they are always continuously changing and have been changing for centuries and millennia, if they are that old. And they have an inbuilt potential for growth in particular ways and up to certain limits, of course. But that is more important than the fact that they may have been created at specific points of time in the past and are evidence of those original processes. None of them, no monuments, are still in the conditions in which they were once created. They've all been changed and developed and reused in many different ways, not the least in the context of present-day heritage management. And I think it's those changes that are ultimately more important, and embracing them will help us more to also have benefits for preparedness, resilience, and recovery in the context of disaster and conflict. Now, as it happens, these ideas, they may seem quite different from what you're used to in heritage management, but these are issues that are discussed widely at the moment in other contexts. And I want to give you one example. Very recently, in fact, 2 weeks ago, I came across a new book by Tim Ingold, who is, of course, one of the most prominent social anthropologists of our time. And in his new book, he argues he makes a very similar point, and it's much broader than heritage, but he also addresses heritage. And he says that cultural heritage should not be seen as an inheritance to be transmitted from one generation to the next, but as a living and perduring process of continuous renewal, generating social life under varying circumstances. Now, that's very much the same point I've just been making. We are used to this idea that we transmit the heritage from one generation to the next. But what he's saying is that we should instead be looking at a continuous process that connects us both with the past and with the future. Where monuments and other things we inherit are continuously renewed and continuously employed in processes of generating social life under different cultural circumstances, of course. Now, if you are curious and want to follow this up, this is what the book looks like: The Rise and Fall of Generation Now. I should say that this idea of the generation now, this is very much, which he's criticizing in this book and critiquing. But this is very much the position we take in heritage and heritage doctrine, like the Venice Charter, that which says that we should be, or implies that we should transmit the heritage from this generation to the next generation. These phrases of conserving the heritage for the benefit of future generations are very much offered in the spirit of how Ingold describes the generation now. And as I just outlined, he is offering an alternative approach to how to think about generations and ultimately about human history and the responsibility we have today. So I want to recommend that book to those of you who have the time and the inclination to follow this up. Right, now what does that mean for disaster and conflict? Now the point is that sites and monuments contribute to generating social life under different circumstances. So they are resources that can offer something, offer added value, if you like, to situations that differ from constantly. And of course, that also includes situations of disaster and conflict. In this sense, sites and monuments constitute living and perduring processes of continuous renewal, regeneration, and possibility, just in the way that Ingold has it in his book. So the point is, I think, that we shouldn't focus so much on what we may lose. Heritage management is so often about loss and damage and threats to conservation. And I believe that doesn't help us so much. That makes us sad, and it may affect the way we perceive identities, that they are also threatened, even though there's no immediate connection between the two. We shouldn't essentialize heritage, but instead ask, what can heritage do in specific circumstances? For example, post-disaster circumstances. Heritage offers possibilities to engage people and in joint projects, and to maybe recover society through focuses on particular sites or on particular traditions, and intangible heritage also. So I think here are possibilities that we should get better at using, and I think it's the role of heritage management to develop these possibilities and make them available to society. Now let's look at some concrete examples, because I think that's always helpful in situations like that. And I'll offer two examples that I came across over the last year. The first one is very recent. I've just returned from the Getty Center in Los Angeles, and the Getty has one attraction that really caught my attention. And if you've ever been to the Getty, you will remember that since 1997 there is the Central Garden by Robert Irwin. Right in the middle of the Getty, you see one of my pictures here in the presentation. You can look at that a bit bigger so you can see the details. Now, this is you may think it's, and to some extent, it looks like a park or a garden, but actually it's not. Actually, formally, it is an artwork. And Robert Irwin, the artist, is one of the foremost artists of his generation in the US, and he passed away recently last autumn. But he left this as one of his main legacies. Now, the point is that this is an artwork that is not being conserved in a specific condition for as long as possible, like other artwork also at the Getty that is displayed in the exhibitions. But this is an artwork that is in fact renewed very frequently and continuously. The plants that make this artwork, they are renewed on a daily cycle. There's obviously a change between day and night, and you see as the blossoms open up in the morning. They also renewed in annual seasons, and in fact, at the Getty, this being California, they don't have 4 seasons, but they replant parts of the garden 3 times a year. Not everything, but some parts, so that it's always working in every season. So there's no constancy. Things are changed regularly throughout the year. And finally, the whole garden is also adapted over the years, and in fact, from one generation to the next. And Irwin was very aware of that. There's a dedication to his daughter as part of this artwork of the garden. And he said in interviews he gave that he believes that the garden will improve with age. Like heritage actually also does sometimes, and that's because it changes in character, and certain things are added and other things are lost. But this is not a problem. It's not something you want to minimize, and certainly the chief gardener I talked to at the Getty is not interested in minimizing the changes, but in managing them and in making also the garden more resilient by adapting it to certain changes. And an obvious example is climate change, of course, and that happens in Los Angeles as much as anywhere. And it means that certain things will need to be adjusted over time. Certain species grow better under different conditions than before, or maybe other plants will need to be introduced that cope better with the circumstances that they have. And Irwin was very much aware of this, and he welcomed such changes. So this is a different understanding of an artwork that is meant to change over time. And I should say that it's also very clear that this is a very popular artwork in the Getty, and it may be, although I don't have the figures, but from what I hear, from what I understand, there are more visitors to the garden than to the exhibitions in the museum at the Getty. It's vastly popular, and people, practically all visitors, come by the garden and sit there and picnic and enjoy their time on the benches and on the grass. And they do that, or while they're doing this, they are embracing the change. They love the seasons that are visible in the garden. They don't want to see what is left from the last winter. And they appreciate the care of the gardeners. Now, this term of care is important because that's a different kind of ethic. It's not an ethics of conservation, but it's an ethics of care. And gardeners are attending to the needs of this artwork continuously and making decisions that affect the way it looks and its character. And that's the way in which they address risk of disaster. So they minimize risk. It's their way of preparedness by making adjustments that will make the site less vulnerable to conditions, bad conditions like those associated with climate change. Now, Irvin, actually, there's an inscription as part of the garden. There are two sentences which Irvin wrote and which are visible to visitors. And those I just want to read before I go on to the second example. And the first sentence, what Irvin puts there to visitors, is that he says, ever changing, never less than whole. Ever changing, never less than whole. So this is something that goes against the Venice Charter, but I think that is very important to think about. So although the garden is changing continuously, as I said, from day and night, over the seasons and also over the years, it is always complete. It's never missing anything. It's never lacking anything. It's always complete and whole. And the second sentence Irvin puts to visitors is ever present, never twice the same. So that is a development over time, he means here. Ever present, never twice the same. So it means that over time, of course, it also changes, as I've just indicated. And the garden is never the same in different presents, but it's still the same garden. And that's, again, something that the Venice Charter cannot handle, because it implies that, or it actually says that that you need to maintain the witnesses of the past in their authenticity. That means not changing and always being the same as much as possible, at least. That's an aspiration that the garden doesn't have. So that presents a different approach to management and conservation of art and heritage. I want to give you a second example that is maybe even more interesting, and that is an artwork that I came across in Paris a year ago, although the artwork was produced 2 years ago, by Fabrice Hubert. It's called Homme de Terre, which in English means something like man of earth. And you see here the picture. So let's look at it. Now, what you see, this is well, it's an earthen body. It's not an actual body, but it's clay that represents a person, and it's connected to different kinds of fluids, water, and it results in plants growing out of this body. Now this is, and you see a picture in the background where of the design of that artwork. Now this is something that is not about a specific site in a specific place, but this is about humanity at large, and it shows drastic changes, and of course also a drastic form of regeneration of this clay human beings. You see here, it symbolizes how humans become humus, or how humans turn into soil, and ultimately become part of eternal processes. Eternal in the sense that they are part of Earth and natural processes that have always been part of Earth as soon as it created conditions that, or Earth had conditions that are still with us today, where there are soils and plants. And this is here, it's about the relation between people returning to the soil and becoming part of these natural processes. So this is not an ancestor. This is not somebody we try to maintain or we try to recover in some form. This is this is about growing plants from the resources that humans, in fact, also constitute. So it's offering something, an additional value to the world through the very materiality of the body, even though in this case it's not a real body, but a clay body. And it is about what people can become. As I said earlier, it's in heritage we should focus more on what we do today and how we can contribute and what we could become, rather than where we're coming from and who our ancestors maybe were. This is an extreme example here, Fabrice Hubert, homme du terme of what that could mean, also in relation to the natural world. It's no longer on show now. You have to go to the internet to see representations of this artwork, but it strikes me that this is extremely interesting, and it represents a different way of engaging with heritage, and well worth discussing in more detail in relation to the issues here at hand on disaster and conflict, because this is a different attitude to those sort of processes. Right, let me finish up with the last few slides here. Now, if we look at not just the Venice Charter, but also the World Heritage Convention from 1972, so a little bit younger, then we see that they are explicitly on the protection, conservation, and transmission to future generations of cultural heritage. It seems to me that this is a policy and an attitude that is very far from what I've just presented, and what may be at least as, if not more, appropriate in the present situation of our world. Now, what I think is that people's preparedness, resilience, and recovery vis-a-vis disaster and conflict may be best supported by embracing change as growth, by supporting processes that can benefit people and other living beings. So by focus on continuing processes rather than on maintaining an original condition that has long since passed. That's my point, and I've given you the example of the Central Garden at the Getty, Robert Irving's artwork, where this seems to be implemented already. This is a heritage that is constantly changing, and I've also referred to Fabrice Hubert's Man of Earth, where you see in one specific artwork what this could mean, and how the very idea of who we are as human beings in relation to the natural world may be connected fruitfully to ideas of growth and regeneration in a very literal way that I think is also interesting to pursue further in a heritage context. Now, finally, we may ask, what does this mean for the future of the Venice Charter? And I think you have a sense of where I'm heading. Well, I'm presenting you a rhetorical question here, which is the one I want to leave you with. Maybe it would not be a disaster to overcome the limitations of the Venice Charter. Maybe we should think about now 60 years after it was passed, what should come next, and how can we find the right kind of policies for maybe the next 60 years. So that's what I wanted to offer you today. Here's a webpage if you want to find out more on what we do on Heritage Futures. Thank you very much for your attention.